Hey everyone! Recently I did a video where I covered dash cards that are pretty much unplayed in most lists, and so the idea of the video was kind of covering a lot of cards that exist in the Mechanologist card pool that are not actually really used by anyone, and kind of breaking down what fringe cases the cards had, why they're typically excluded from most lists. And it was a really fun concept, and obviously as a channel that focuses mostly on dash but also has had a history of playing a lot of Rhinar and kind of brewing up different versions of Rhinar, people of course wanted to hear a similar discussion but with the Brute card pool. So once again, like the dash video, I'm only going to be covering the Brute card pool. Levi is not a hero I'm very experienced with or really know much about, so clearly someone like Mansant is much more qualified to talk about unused Levi cards. So yeah, so we're only going to be covering Rhinar today. So kicking it off, we're going to be looking at Ravenous Meat Axe. Now this is one that even I kind of go back and forth on whether or not it's actually really good or not. A lot of people ask me about this. Even locally, people seem to always want to go back to this weapon, right? There's always a consideration of like, well, for playing Romping Club, like, isn't Ravenous Meat Axe just better? So it attacks for 2. It comes in for 3. When you attack with it, you're going to draw a card and then discard a card. So it'll be at random, but assuming that you're just going to attack with a Meat Axe as your only card, you're just going to draw and discard off the top most likely. And then if it's a 6 or more attack, it gets +2. So the interesting thing about this is hypothetically, if you hit every turn, then you're swinging for 5 with an Intimidate trigger. On its surface, this obviously seems better than Romping Club. The only thing I would consider is that obviously there's some RNG involved with this, unless if you're playing a Rhinar list that specifically is not going to really run any non-attacks or underpowered 6s. And I mean, you could do something like that, but also that kind of goes against the ethos of the club builds, which are going to be running defense reactions, barraging beatdown. Like, they're focused on sort of a more defensive grindy list, so it's not really possible to run an all-power 6 deck that also utilizes Ravenous Meat Axe. And if you're going to run maybe like a shell that runs Pulping or Wild Ride, then you would just want to run the Romping Club just because it'll be the guaranteed 5 every time. The only other thing too is that in the club builds, a genuine way to end the game is through fatigue. By that I mean fatiguing your opponent. Just clubbing for 4 every turn requires 1 to 2 cards from them eventually. It's kind of like a way to fatigue out opponents. And the weird thing about Ravenous Meat Axe is that it fatigues yourself for attacking with it. So if you're going to play a long game where you might try to run your opponent out of threats and eventually out of cards, which sounds strange, but it's actually a very reliable strategy as long as you and your opponent are playing efficiently on time. Ravenous Meat Axe just can't really get there, but mostly it's just because it's a little bit inconsistent. Next up, we have a hot one. People love this card. I have used it in the past. I think that it slowly is kind of falling out of favor. I'm not really seeing it in as many winning lists anymore. I'm not really seeing a whole lot of discussion about it. It pretty much has kind of faded into obscurity, but it's Tear Limb from Limb, which is a non-block brute action, costs 2, pitches for 3. You're going to draw and discard a random card, and then if the card had 6 or more power, brute attack that you play, or specifically an attack action card, gets +X attack, where X is the base attack of the card you discarded. Where this can really shine, obviously, is if you were to draw and discard something like an Alpha Rampage and then attack with a Swing Big, and now the Swing Big comes in for 17. Now, obviously, that's the most high roll, top end of the curve. But obviously, on the low end, you can honestly just brick with this card. I mean, at least it has Go Again, but there's just a lot of issues with it. It's just trying to cash in that much for a stronger, above average attack. This requires you to probably keep about a 4-card hand, and you would probably be better off just playing a different aggro line or just not running the card at all. It doesn't block, so that's also a liability. And if you're going to play this card with the assumption that you're going to be attacking with another card in your hand, you always have to consider the possibility that you may discard the card that you wanted to play as the attack, or you may discard your resource card. So there's just too many ways that this can backfire on you and end up breaking your entire turn in just multiple ways. And even on its best case scenario, it's just not that impactful compared to what other sort of aggressive, explosive turns Rhinar can have. I can definitely understand why people would want to play it. There are some lists that people call cheetah builds, which are going to be running pretty much all the non-block attacks, so just really trying to lean into that aggressive side of Rhinar. But those are pretty fringe decks. At least they're not typically the most common lists that I see, especially in terms of tournament placing. So I think the card is fun. If you enjoy playing this card and you enjoy the sort of highs and lows of it, I totally understand. I've played it in the past, but it is, sort of relegated to that spot of being a little bit on the sidelines of what's considered the staples of Brute. Next up, we have Primeval Bellow. So it's a 0-cost Brute action, blocks 3. Let's go again. As an additional cost to play it, you discard a random card. Your next Brute attack this turn gets +5. Obviously, where this is really good is on a 3-card hand, where you could play this, have 2 yellows in your hand, and then all of a sudden Romping Club comes in for 10. The only problem is that that's the best case scenario for this card, and at that point you're looking at playing the Romping Club build where you want to block down to 1 card and then attack with a club every turn. So you want to block for probably like 9 damage, maybe more if you have defensive reactions. The problem with this is that Primeval Bellow requires you to have a 3-card hand and then to swing for 10. So a 3-card hand that attacks for 10 is like really not that impressive. Although the only case where I can see this being useful in a club build is if you want to pitch stack this early and maybe run the yellow or the blue and use them to attack with the Romping Club, and then later on in the game use them on a larger hand and try to close it out with the club. It is asking for a lot with like much better options in the club build, and that's pretty much the only place where you would see this. Obviously it won't be played in the claws build just because it would just require you to lose too many cards from hand. And the claws build obviously wants to keep 4 to 5 card hands, so you have the ability to have enough resources to play these go again attacks and then attack with the claws afterwards. So it's almost there, it just barely misses the mark, and there are just better things to slot in the Romping Club builds. Specifically just Barrage and Beatdown. Barrage and Beatdown allows you to threaten huge damage turns with only 2 cards in hand, and in certain metas, that Barrage and Beatdown is almost guaranteed damage if you're in a meta where people don't want to be blocking with 2 cards a turn. We especially saw that in the last meta with Starvo and Shane and Briar. These are decks that if they block with 2 cards, they're probably not winning, or they're probably going to lose tempo on the next turn. That was a nice way to guarantee it, and then also be blocking with 2 cards. And Primeval Bellow just sort of falls a little bit short, but I could also see this card being good. Next up, we have Bad Beats. Bad Beats is a 0-cost brute action, blocks for 3. You roll a 6-sided die, and then if the number is 4, 5, or 6, the next brute attack action card you play this turn gains +5. And then the blue and the yellow just have a tighter top end to satisfy the condition. The biggest issue with this card, we just looked at Primeval Bellow. It could actually target the Romping Club, and the biggest issue with this is it specifically says attack action card. And also, it's not something like Rolling Thunder, where Rolling Thunder not only can buff the Romping Club, but also can have a very small payoff. Like you can roll really poorly on Rolling Thunder, but still get a couple extra damage. The problem with Bad Beasts is it's an all or nothing card. You're either, going to the moon or you're crashing, right? It's an all or nothing card. You're either getting the +5 or you're not getting anything at all. And so for that reason, if you're going to want a more consistent list to bring to a tournament to play for 6 or 7 Swiss rounds and then maybe a top 8, you're not really going to want an explosive deck that can brick really hard, just because throughout the day that variance can kind of punish you really, really hard. And so some people do argue you should play high variance decks at a tournament level. But personally for me, I like playing tighter, more consistent lists. And then obviously in the claws build, there are just better things to run, because of course in the claws build we want 6 attacks. We don't want more non-attacks in the deck, because then it increases your ratios, and then it's harder if you want to play these Wild Rider pulping effects, or you can just accidentally lose go again if you were to draw Bad Beats or Primeval Bellow or tear limb from limb off the top. Like it's all one big liability. We have Bonehead Barrier up next. This one's interesting. So you're going to roll a 6-sided die. You prevent the next X damage that be dealt to your hero this turn, where X is the number you rolled. Cost 1, doesn't block, it's a brute instant. The only fringe cases I can see for this card are a meta where Kano or other wizards are very strong, because this just prevents an X damage. So if you roll a 6, you don't even need to pay for Arcane Barrier, and you could just prevent an entire Aether Wildfire and then still have 1 more left over, or you can just block 1 for the next arcane damage spell as well. Especially with Icelander now too. This is also pretty good into go wide strategies, which would be something like probably Phi with Uprising coming out, or Katsu with Kodachis, because you can just play this off of a tunic counter and then prevent the Kodachis and maybe the next breakpoint. I mean, even on the low end, if you roll a 1 or a 2, you're still, effectively blocking 1 to 2 Kodachis with a single card, which is more than what Brute can already do. So I see it as a fun sideboard card that actually does have some pretty good applications. The only problem is that it is just another die roll mechanic, which is just really unfortunate for Brute, that they're kind of pigeonholed into having all of these random elements of chance that other classes just don't really have to deal with. So there's just a possibility that every time you play this card throughout an armory event, or a pro quest, or even worse, like a calling, you just roll a 1 every single time. So there is just always a huge downside to these cards. Up next we have Barrage and Bighorn, and we can lump in some other cards, maybe like Savage Feast on red, maybe Smash Instinct or Riled Up. These are all cards that work really well in the yellow slot, just because they can be pitched to Romping Club to attack for 4 every turn, and they block for 3. They're also 6 power, so they meet a lot of the conditions of what Brute wants to do. Also, in the claw builds, they can be used to pitch each for a Mandible Claw. So the yellows have amazing utility, and until there are better replacements like we just recently saw with Pack Call, there's not much of a reason to be replacing these cards. However, in the red slots, most of these cards are extremely weak, so I'm going to be lumping them all together as what we consider a lot of filler cards in Rhinar that just meet the criteria of pitching well, blocking well, and being power 6s. So they meet the criteria of what we want for the non-staple cards. So cards that are not like Massacre or Wild Ride Pulping, Alpha Rampage, Blood Rush Bellows, all these cards, if they're not in that category, do they satisfy the conditions of those other cards? And they do. But things like Barrage and Bighorn, for instance, are just super unplayable as a threat itself, requiring 3 cards to do 7 damage, and then maybe having Go Again, but it's just so difficult, especially requiring 3 cards to maybe have Go Again probably means that even if your opponent somehow doesn't block this out, you're just probably not going to have anything to follow up with, which is just a huge problem. Same goes for Riled Up just not being a very threatening card. Smash Instinct is a little bit better, but the yellow is more than enough. The 7 damage on the red just doesn't make it super relevant. Smash Instinct is just a good late game closer. You don't really need it to be red because you need to pitch it tightly for a Romping Club or for a Mandible Claw early game. And Savage Swing, some people like playing the red off of tuna counters. You can play a 2-card hand and do 7, but I just think that it's just better in a yellow slot, although I do understand people wanting to run the red version. And finally, we're going to cover Swing Fist Think Later. Now this card was actually pretty popular at one point, and I still could see it having a resurgence. I was even considering using it in my OTK Rhinar list when I was considering whether or not I was going to be attending the Calling in Vegas for the Blitz Steam event. And this card is kind of interesting because you could fill a slot like Wild Ride, where obviously we're not really looking to discard Wild Ride, so you're going to be playing this anyway. And you can play Swing Fist Think Later, and then if you pitch to blue to play, then you can follow up with a Claw, and so that's a 3-card hand that does 7, but goes a little bit wider. On a Blood Rush Bellow turn, this can be really strong too. And the only downside, of course, is that it's just a little bit weak. It doesn't really inherently do anything super strong. The fact that this card is from your hand means that you're losing an entire card in your hand, which can be really punishing, obviously. Would require you to have a 3 to 4 card hand to maybe not do a whole lot of damage back to your opponent. The only upside here, and the reason why I was considering running it over Wild Ride, is the fact that it blocks for 3. So in an aggressive build of Rhinar, at least on a turn where you need to block out your opponent, there's still an option to do so with this card. I can see it maybe being good in the future. It just would require a really tight list that someone would have to brew up. Maybe it's something I should try out that maybe wants to really capitalize on these go wide effects. And maybe you play this in more of the cheetah builds with Pack Hunt and Pulping, Wild Ride, these non-block cards that hit really hard, sort of want to cash in on this aggressive Brute style. I think the only downside of that playstyle is that Brute has traditionally worked really well as a mid-range deck with this ability to kind of disrupt blocking in more defensive decks. It also has the upside of pretty overstated cards on some things, like Alpha Rampage being a 3 for 9. Of course, it does have the downside of requiring the discard effect, but with some cards like Massacre, that's actually an upside to the card. So when you consider it from that angle, and if you look at Rhinar as this mid-range deck that can sort of fit this mold between a defensive grindy deck and this very explosive aggro deck, it seems to work best in that way. So this idea of having this super aggro, throw everything at the wall style effect is really fun. However, it is just a little bit difficult because then you're kind of forcing Rhinar to only be an aggro deck. And I just don't think Rhinar has the card pool to really keep up with a lot of the other aggro decks in the format. I think you'll probably be outraced and outclassed most of the times. But if you do want to try it out, I think Swing Fist Think Later is a great card to do so, and it can fit in a lot of really fun explosive Mandible Claw shells. So totally give it a go. And that was the video for today. Let me know what you think. I just wanted to kind of briefly cover a lot of cards that have kind of filtered in and out of lists. I've seen all of these cards at one point or another pop up into Rhinar lists, but on the whole, I don't really see them as often. So while a lot of these are actually a lot more playable than dash cards we covered, like for instance, I've never seen Aether Sink in a single dash list, but I have seen things like Primeval Bellow or Bonehead Barrier, Tear Limb from Limb, or Meat Axe. These are cards that I actually have seen in lists before, whereas the dash cards I really don't ever see. So these are all cards I think are actually a lot more playable, but I think it is just because the Brute pool is just a little bit lacking right now. There are a lot of filler cards like we talked about, cards that are just there to meet conditions of being a power 6 that blocks for 3 and that pitches well, ideally for 2 resources. So hopefully in the future, we can find more ways to either incorporate these cards in the list or just find ways to strengthen the brute card pool, so we can kind of solidify like what the best brute cards are and which ones we're typically going to exclude from most lists. So thanks for checking out the video. Let me know what you thought. Let me know if you agree with the list, if there's anything you think I forgot, or a card maybe I misevaluated. Feel free to let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.